Good morning. I'm Danielle Holly Walker, the Dean of Howard University School of Law. Welcome to the HU Ideas Symposium, our homecoming policy conference, From Protest to Policy, the Pursuit of Racial Justice. This is our very first panel of our 3-day conference, and we are excited to start off with a panel on community organizing before and after the election. So I will turn it over to our moderator. Thank you so much to everyone for being here.
Thank you so much for joining. I'm thrilled and honored to be moderating a panel of such luminaries. We've got some powerhouse organizers from across the country. Just so quickly, I'll introduce myself. I'm Dr. Karthik Balasubramanian. I'm a professor of information systems at the Howard University School of Business. I'm also the founder of BLOC Power, an organization focused on driving increased Black voter turnout and civic engagement through compensated microfield organizing. So essentially paying folks to look through a list of people that they might know and organizing people to organize at a much broader and deeper level than through technology and good data than kind of what was otherwise possible. And I'm thrilled to count among our partners folks on this panel. So without further ado, wanted to start introducing our panelists. We've got I can't overstate how transformational some of these folks have been in the field of community organizing, specifically focused on Black voter empowerment and in general moving us from protest to policy. So our first panelist is Angela Lang. Angela Lang is the Executive Director of Black Leaders Organizing for Communities in Milwaukee, also known as BLOC. Before her position at BLOC, she was a political director for a Future Wisconsin, where she worked to develop partnerships with local organizations and oversee local grant processes. In addition, she worked with SEIU, Service Employees International Union, where she was an organizer and state council director, coordinating the political endorsement process for SEIU and organizing the home care and nursing home workers union in the Fight for 15 campaign. Angela is motivated by making substantial and transformative change in the community while developing young local leaders of color. In her organizing experience, it's clear that there's a deep need for cultural competency, diversity, and more seats at the table. So thrilled to turn it over to Angela.
Everyone, good morning. Thanks for being here. A little bit about BLOC is that we launched in November of 2017 in a lot of ways as a response to the 2016 election. On one hand, due to the outcome, but on another hand, everyone was blaming our community for that outcome. And it was really frustrating and infuriating, to say the least. Turnout was down all across the state. Yes, turnout was down specifically in the Black community by 13 or 19%, depending on where you go. But everyone wanted to focus on us and, quite frankly, blame us when we were some of the most disenfranchised and least engaged. There were folks whose door that we knocked on shortly after we launched, who said, "I lived here for 5 to 10 years and you're the first person to knock on my door." And so we knew that we wanted to do things differently. We wanted to take the traditional model of a paid canvas and field programs and really turn it on its head, understand and analyze what some of the gaps were, and do the best that we can to fill them. And so November of 2017, we started knocking on doors. We had a handful of organizers, and the only question on their script at the time was, What does it look like for the Black community to thrive? And a lot of times people didn't know how to answer that question, let alone, again, being really skeptical of the people that were asking it, because a lot of times when you're knocking in our community, and we've seen it cycle after cycle, people come in a couple weeks, a couple months before an election and try to tell our community what we should be doing, how we should be thinking, how we should be analyzing the political process, with no real relationship building and no trust. And so we said that we were going to take it upon ourselves. We were going to do that work ourselves. It was going to be a year-round program, and we were going to train folks from the community to have these deeper conversations. And so in some cases, again, trying to be different, our first paid canvas was the spring of 2018. And that was mostly a state Supreme Court race, one that people generally don't pay a lot of attention to. For a couple cycles before that, people didn't really know about the state Supreme Court or pay attention to it. It wasn't one of those things that was in play often. And we said that we wanted to get involved. We wanted to make sure that everyone knew the importance of the state Supreme Court, specifically why our community should show up. And people thought we were crazy. We said that we wanted to loop in low performing wards, the wards that typically don't turn out the highest. We said that we wanted to talk to them. When we were working with funders on a national level, they thought we were crazy. It's a spring election. No one cares about this election. Why are you taking time to talk to people who need to even be persuaded to vote? That's not the typical universe of people you talk to. But we pushed back. And I'm not a field person, but I'm glad our gut was right. We saw results a couple of weeks later that we were able to increase turnout by upwards of 3% or so in some of these places. And our model of just being able to talk to people, people that are traditionally left behind, and making sure that we're having multiple conversations with them. We aren't just, coming in and saying, hey, vote for this person. Our ambassadors are our field team. When you think of canvassers, we have ambassadors, and we changed the name from a canvasser to ambassador because even though I do things like this, they are the face of the organization. They do direct voter contact in a way that I never will. And it's important for us to make sure that people put respect on their work and on their name. And so our ambassadors, they go through roughly 30 hours of training before they even knock a door. I've been a part of organizations. I've been a part of the problem where someone walks in asking for a canvassing job. I have them fill out paperwork and I get them on their way that day, and they are out on doors within an hour of even walking foot in the door asking for a job. People can't be properly trained and feel prepared to go out and to have those conversations if that's how we're training folks. So we put our folks through 30 hours of training. It includes this thing called Civics Jeopardy, which is now being live streamed every Friday on our Facebook page. But having people really understand and digging deeper into the political analysis. What is the difference between a state senator and a US senator? How does county government work with city government? What are their jurisdictions? Who do I call if my trash isn't being picked up, right? Having people understand this political process, and then also understanding how to disrupt it and interject ourselves into a political process that wasn't meant for us. And so we wanted to make sure that we are embedding leadership development in every aspect of our work, whether it's through our ambassador program, our fellowship program, which is a 10-week program where we do a deeper dive with a smaller group of fellows, usually about 10 to 15, and talking about the history of voting rights, the history of voter suppression. This year, the theme was around the history of voter suppression, having people being agitated and understanding that what we're seeing, how we were forced to vote in person in the April election, there's history behind that, there's context behind that. And so one of the adjustments that we've made with COVID, because normally we'd be out in the field, we were really excited to knock about 500,000 doors. Our team definitely felt that we could do it. They were excited for that door number, but we have, moved exclusively virtually, like a lot of other organizations, texting, phone banking, limiting our in-person events, trying to do them where we can, where it's safe. Wisconsin's cases are rapidly going the wrong direction. There's a surge in cases in Wisconsin, but we're also taking this opportunity to dig into history. Our ambassadors, you can only text and phone bank so much, so we give them homework assignments. Research gerrymandering, research the history of voter suppression, research the history of John Lewis and his contributions to our work and how it impacts us today. So really taking a broader understanding of the issues that we're living in now, having a deeper context, but then also having folks understand this political process. lastly, what I'll say is that there are times that we have to have three separate conversations. One, on one hand, making sure that we're turning a non-voter into a voter. That's a big conversation in and of itself. Two, we want to make sure that people are educated on the things that they're voting about. They need to understand why they're showing up for a US senator and how that directly impacts their life. And then lastly, we want people to support the candidates that we're supporting. We do have the ability to make endorsements. So these are three separate conversations that we're trying to have and meet people where they're at, that we can't have, 20 days before an election. That's why we need to have a year-round program, and also making sure that we're not shaming people for not voting. There are a lot of folks who haven't had their voting rights restored yet in the state of Wisconsin, and people just don't feel confident in the political process and that it's working for them. So we don't believe in shaming folks. We want to get to the core of why people aren't voting, getting to that core of that disconnect instead of simply blaming folks like people did in our community 4 years ago.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those inspiring words, Angela. We're looking forward to a great discussion after the other panelists have had an opportunity to make their opening remarks. Next, I want to turn to Arisha Hatch. Arisha is the Vice President and Chief of Campaigns of Color of Change, leading the organization's civic engagement, advocacy, digital, and organizing work across a number of racial justice issues. Her portfolio of work includes criminal justice and economic justice reform, criminal and economic justice reform, democracy and corporate accountability. Arisha is a key leader, innovator, and strategist in the racial justice movement. Since joining Color of Change in 2012, Arisha, along with her team, has led groundbreaking campaigns that have resulted in real-world changes for the Black community. So, Arisha, take it away.
Thank you so much for having me, Karthik. And it's so good to see so many faces I knew. When I saw the panel, I signed up because Nze and Angela were there, and I'm just huge fans of their work. Color of Change is one of the largest Black-led racial justice organizations in the country. And as Karthik mentioned, I joined in 2012. Actually, February 1st of 2012 was my first day. And a couple of weeks later, Trayvon Martin was killed. And so my perspective as a racial justice organizer really comes from that arc between 2012 and now, which I think has just been an incredibly transformative, trauma-filled cycle for Black people in this country. I am the daughter of Patricia, a retired elementary school teacher, and Ollie, a salesman. My father passed away, unfortunately, on March 9th this year, 2 days before California called for a shelter in place. And so, at Color of Change, we think a lot about this idea of empowering Black joy. And I am an organizer who is organizing through grief, who is constantly on the hunt for Black joy. And, for not only has this been a transformative year, I think, for our country, but it's also been a transformative year for myself personally and so many other people I know. One of the moments that really stood out for me as someone who is organizing through grief was a video of Gigi Floyd that surfaced in the wake of the protest, where Gigi Floyd is George Floyd's 6-year-old daughter, and she was on the arms of Stephen Jackson watching the protest saying, "My daddy changed the world, my daddy changed the world." And that just, that has stayed with me for months. As someone who is making meaning out of the passing of her own father, as someone that has been doing this sort of community organizing work for a while now, I really believe it is our mandate as Black organizers to help manifest Gigi's dream, to put words and more vocabulary to it. And so that's how I really think about our work. Color of Change was founded in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. It's our 15-year anniversary, no gala this year. But our founders were watching Black people stranded on their rooftops. They were watching as corporate media called us looters and rioters for trying to get basic survival tools and supplies. They were, and elected officials were patting themselves on the back for a job well done as we watched Black people stranded, really. And so my organization, in a lot of ways, was founded in Black pain. We were founded in a moment of Black abandonment. And we were founded in a cultural moment where powerful decision makers, both corporate and political, didn't seem to care about Black people at all. And so there was a point when Kanye West went on the Red Cross show and said that George Bush didn't care about Black people. And everybody sort of laughed, and our founders did what they could do. They sent out an email to 1,000 of their closest friends with a subject line that said Kanye was right. And in that email, they went on to unpack all the ways in which they believed that Kanye was right, how we were surviving in a culture where powerful folks didn't care about disappointing Black people. And so we really think of our work as responding to the news cycle in a lot of ways and giving people easy strategic things to do in order to push for the changes that they want to see in the world. And we have built on that model for several years now. We now have over 7 million members who are taking action across the country on a number of different issues. And so that is the work that we're doing. When I came into Color of Change, there was this belief that our members only wanted to sign petitions. They didn't want to go outdoors or join protests or get together in person, that it was an online community. But in 2016, we decided to test the theory for the first time. And we invited folks out to a textathon to actually text voters about the importance of voting in a local DA race. And we sent out an email and put up some ads on Facebook, and hundreds of people showed up. And anybody that's been doing community organizing for any amount of time, if you have an event and hundreds of people show up, you're like, oh, I should do that again. And so really, and we've been doing that again. We've been doing that over and over again, even in the midst of a pandemic where we can't do it in physical space. Folks have been coming together. And so now, in addition to the millions of folks who take online action with Color of Change, there are thousands of people who identify as neighborhood squad leaders. They are building neighborhood teams, and they are building it under a mantra of Empower Black Joy. And so we talk about Black joy a lot in our work. It is the vision. Black joy certainly isn't the absence of pain or trauma, as I am an example of. It exists in spite of all of that. And empowering Black joy, we believe requires constant struggle, but it is an aspirational term. And although we experience it occasionally or in short bursts, Black joy is our version of hope, even in the midst of a global pandemic. And so when we talk to our members about empowering Black joy, that just isn't about asking people to vote in election, although we do believe that that is a means towards empowering Black joy. It's more than just asking people to participate in the census, although we do believe that is a means for empowering Black joy. It is also hosting community service events and brunches. It is our members in Jacksonville who, before each school year, deliver backpacks full of school supplies to Black folks in their community who can't afford it. It is our members who started a campaign in March, just as the pandemic set in and schools moved virtual, to demand that all kids have access to internet so they can participate in schools. Or our members who demanded that a local farmers market in Crenshaw, the only farmers market in a Black community in a Black food desert in Southern California, wasn't shut down, while all of these other healthy farmers markets in white communities were allowed to remain open. And so we try to come in with that ethic. We expect that of our members. And our hope is that every single action that they take towards improving their local communities really embodies that mantra. And I guess the final thing I'll say is that, we're in a critical moment in our broader democracy in terms of the health and safety of our communities. It's more clear than ever that we are, as it's become cliche, battling dual pandemics of both COVID, over policing and incarceration, and there are probably a few more that we're not naming in that course. And so we are organizing with an ethic of working to make sure that people continue to move with that shared purpose of moving towards Black joy. And I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Arisha, for those words. I think it's abundantly clear how important and critical all of this work is so far. Want to switch gears and give you a twofer. So I want to introduce Ensei Ufot and Rod Smith, both of the New Georgia Project. So first, Ensei is the Chief Executive Officer of the New Georgia Project and its affiliate, the New Georgia Project Action Fund. Ensei leads both organizations with a data-informed approach and a commitment to developing tools that leverage technology with the goal of making it easier for every voter to engage in every election. Ensei and her team are also developing Georgia's homegrown talent by training and organizing local activists across the state of Georgia. She's also dedicated her entire life and her career to working on civil, human, and workers' rights issues, and leads two organizations who are with the complementary aim to strengthen Georgia's democracy. Ensei's leadership, under Ensei's leadership, and the New Georgia Project has registered almost 500,000 Georgians to vote. So that's Ensei. And Roderick Smith. We're also thrilled to have Roderick Smith, who's a deputy field organizer or deputy field director for the New Georgia Project. He's deeply rooted in civic engagement and organizing. Roderick is originally from Detroit, Michigan, and is no stranger to the hard work of organizing. While working with NGP for the last 4 years, he and his colleagues have built people power in the state of Georgia to challenge the status quo at every turn. He credits his education at Florida A&M University, won't hold that against you, for watering desire to educate, advocate, and empower minorities through civic engagement. So with that, Ensei and Rod, would you take it away, please? You may be on mute. Ensei, yeah.
7 months of this. You would think. Yeah, I am really happy to be here with you all today. As are my dogs. They're not bribable these days. I've been working home. The treats don't work anymore. So as Karthik mentioned, I'm the CEO of the New Georgia Project and the New Georgia Project Action Fund. We're probably best known for our large-scale voter registration work, but that is nowhere near sort of the sum total of the interventions that we seek to make. We happen to believe that Black people deserve the best. Including in their movement homes and in their political and organizing homes. A little bit about Georgia. Georgia's going to be the first state in the Deep South with a white minority. We're going through a massive demographic shift. In fact, what's happening in Georgia is massive. It's happening very, very quickly. And it's unique and unlike the shifts that are happening in other parts of the country. Almost 2 million people have moved to the state in the past decade. Over 80% of them are people of color. We're talking about, because of census information, we're talking about 2024, 2025, where white people will be the minority in Georgia. And so what does that mean? We don't happen to necessarily believe that demographics don't necessarily equal destiny. And so what does it mean to have a people of color majority in a place like Georgia for our politics and our policy? You know, the minimum wage in Georgia is $5.15 an hour. It's below the federal minimum wage of $7.25. And this is at the same time where Georgia is seen as sort of a new Black Mecca. And a place where Black Americans, particularly like upwardly mobile Black folks, college educated, upwardly mobile Black folks can come and do well economically. And so how do we square that with the fact that if you are born Black and poor in Atlanta, you are 95% likely to die Black and poor in Atlanta? And so while it is at once seen as a a destination, again, for upwardly mobile Black folks, it is also one of the top cities in the country for a racial wealth gap. And so just having a whole bunch of people of color as the majority of the residents and the majority of voters is not going to build us the Georgia where our families can thrive. And so what does it mean to elect officials who not only know what our community's issues and their priorities are, but who feel accountable to us and our communities? Before we began the work of the New Georgia Project, 80% of the incumbents in the legislature would run unopposed. There was sort of a gentleman's agreement between moderate Black Democratic men and conservatives, conservative Republicans in the state, that like, these are our legislative districts, these are your seats, these are our seats, and the work of the people didn't get done. And so when we launched the New Georgia Project, it's like, how do we meet this particular moment, right? So Georgia, people of color are going to make up the majority of Georgians. Also, when we launched, we were looking at sort of, there is a sort of conventional wisdom about red states versus blue states, what's possible in the Deep South, what's possible in former slave states, and what impact it has on our democracy and participation in our elections. And so we started looking at top of the ticket races, and I should flag that the New Georgia Project is a nonpartisan organization, but the numbers are what they are. And so looking at top of the ticket races for about 10 years, the delta, the difference between the successful Republican and the losing Democrat for all of our statewide elections was about 200 to 250,000 votes. And at the time when we launched, there were 1.2 million Black and brown Georgians who were eligible to vote and completely unregistered. So that means that there were 5 times the number of people of color who were eligible to participate in our elections who were not, but 5 times the number that were required to swing any election in Georgia. And so it's really not about red states and blue states, but it's about who shows up. And that's certainly the case for Georgia. I think that also, we view elections as sort of compression points, as opportunities to test our power. It's not why we exist. No one lives for that. Well, we certainly don't. We certainly don't live for elections. The idea is that people will tell you what their hopes, what their fears are for themselves, for their families, for their communities, right? And so our work, we see it as, the way we train our organizers is that you have twice as many ears as a mouth. And so we listen. And we work together in community to figure out how we go about building the Georgia of our futures, the Georgia of our dreams. And it's all about how we build power. And it's to stop bad things from happening, but also to build our vision of the world that we want to live in, the communities that we want to live in. And so I will kick it to my colleague, Rod, to talk a little bit about how we do that.
Thank you, Insei, and good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here with you guys. I'm not sure who added in the bio that I went to Florida A&M University, but whoever did that, But thank you. I've had the pleasure of working under NSA's leadership for the last 4 years, building that people power. Some of the things that we do to build that people power, we have various campaigns that tap into different demographics. Some of those demographics, such as, you know, people who can maybe be interested in, for example, our Black and Green campaign that taps into helping Black farmers in the rural Black Belt, or our Vibe campaign that taps into getting more Black men involved, or our reproductive justice campaign, just to name a few. And we have other various campaigns, but all of these are dedicated to building that people power. Everyone is dedicated to voter registration, as well as voter education, having quality conversations in hopes and in efforts to build a strong, to build better political power, people power, in the Georgia area. And so I'm just so happy to be here to learn and to grow. So thank you all.
Sorry, now I was on mute. Thank you so much, Rada and Ense, for talking about the incredible work that the New Georgia Project does. We've got one more esteemed panelist, and then really looking forward to a great discussion. Dr. Sekou Franklin is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Middle Tennessee State University, MTSU. He's the author of After the Rebellion, Social Movement Activism and Popular Mobilization Among the Post-Civil Rights Generation, and the co-author of Losing Power, African Americans and Racial Polarization in Tennessee Politics, and the editor of the State of Blacks in Middle Tennessee. He is an expert in Tennessee politics and is also the president of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. So Sekou, over to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I was given the charge of offering just a brief overview or history of Black civic engagement and some of the interesting research or things that we should research. I should also say as a footnote that I do work here in Nashville with a group called Democracy Nashville, Democratic Communities, that works a lot on criminal justice issues. So a lot of my work is done outside of the academy with a lot of grassroots organizers and organizations. So I've been given permission to show just a 5 or 10 minute PowerPoint. I'm going to stay underneath my time, and it's going to touch upon some of the things that that was already presented in the by the previous panelists. But I want to say first, thanks for letting me be here. And it's truly an honor to sit here with people on the front lines of this work and really deep in the streets and doing really good work in the struggle. So just to give an overview of Black civic engagement as a charge, and I'm going to focus a lot on a variety of issues or diverse issues, but as you get, I just wanted to make sure I lift up, because we're at Howard University's homecoming, that the work of Black youth organizing and Black youth organizers, and just to say that we have a long history and tradition of Black youth organizing. And that goes from the NAACP Youth Council, Southern Negro Youth Congress, which was a radical organization, that a lot of which has its roots at Howard University. Some of the early thinkers come out of Howard University and founders. The Youth Integrated Marches, the Student Sit-In Movement, SNCC, which from my perspective was the most important young people's organization of the 20th century. The Freedom Rides, we've seen the Black Panther Party of Self-Defense. We've seen the Student Organization for Black Unity, which was an organization that originated out of North Carolina and spread its wings throughout the country. The Student Divestment Movement, we still need a lot more work and research done on this, particularly in the Free South Africa movement. And there was a Black student anchor in that, primarily at the HBCUs. The AFL-CIO Union Summer Program, Juvenile Justice Reform Movement, and Black Lives Matter. And I just kind of taking bits and pieces of some of the work that's already out there. From my perspective, we also should take a deeper dive or deeper look at the Poor People's Campaign, given the resurgence of this idea under William Barber. And the Poor People's Campaign of the 1960s was seen by many people in the literature as largely a failure. I take a different perspective and say that it had a much more deeper impact and broader impact than what we often like to give credit for. But it was really Martin Luther King Jr., who died before the campaign really started, was launched. He was organizing, but it's really his answer to the despair, the poverty that occurred, that was taking place in the country. And I think, you know, one of the backgrounds behind the Poor People's Campaign is I think Black women, whether we're talking about Mary Wright Edelman or people who were really hand to mouth in Mississippi Delta, were the ones who really pushed King to do the Poor People's Campaign. And then it consisted of a variety of tactics and methods, really attacking capitalism, really addressing militarism and poverty. And I like the Poor People's Campaign because I think it was one of the few attempts, you know, in the 20th century to build a broad-based effort with not just Black folks, but Native American activists who were focusing on fishing rights, Southwest Mexican Americans focusing on land rights. The National Welfare Rights Organization formed an alliance with the Poor People's Campaign, and really pushed King to be much more aggressive in his critique of poverty. Appalachian whites, there was even an attempt to organize them, and farm workers. We've had a lot of work, particularly in the 90s and early 2000s, done on juvenile justice. For those people who might be familiar with some of the organizing in the 1990s, a lot of work was looking at trying to resolve or address youth prisons, trying to address capital development programs that focused on maximum security institutions. We saw the emergence of a number of coalitions and groups like the Maryland Juvenile Justice Coalition, PMP, Prison Moratorium Project, the Juvenile Justice Project, Louisiana. We saw work being done in Maryland, work being done in Louisiana, primarily being anchored by, again, grassroots organizations, coalitions, and that really responded to the local context. That is, the organizing coalitions that emerged in Louisiana, which were much different than the ones that emerged in New York, which were much different than the ones that emerged in Maryland. And then AFL Union Summer, again, this was a program that was established in the mid-1960s, really kind of underestimated, but I think an important organization to at least go back and look at, primarily because the AFL-CIO had an HBCU recruitment plan that actually targeted HBCU students as an organizing anchor, actually before the mid-1990s, going back to the late 1980s, early 1990s. And many of these students made up a considerable amount of the people who participated in that Union Summer program. And again, looking at the work of BLM, and we're in our second iteration or second wave of Black Lives Matter. And that first wave that began in 2013, I think we're going to take a look back and look at the kinds of policy interventions that they advanced. I think we can make an argument they were far more successful that even some of the Black middle class leadership wants to give them credit to. And even before this uprising that occurred this summer, we saw major issues being pushed forward in states that I think are credited to many of these young people who came out of the BLM. Just to moving forward, I think in terms of where we go from here and what are some of the things, I'll spend a few minutes talking about redistricting because redistricting is going to really consume much of our agenda, much of our focus really after the 2020 election. And you may remember that, or you may note that yesterday the Supreme Court made a decision to stop the census count, which is going to probably produce an undercount of Black and brown folks and disaffected groups. And this means that grassroots organizations, which were often anchoring census outreach, are going to have to be instrumental and very strategic about anchoring themselves in redistricting fights. The redistricting process is going to control or steer about $600 billion. And redistricting is going to take place all across the country from Congress. It's going to affect state legislatures, city councils, county commissions, school boards, utility districts. And this matters in a sense because the partisan divide that has occurred across the country has increased. Republicans control the majority of the state legislatures, which are going to be responsible for drawing the majority of the congressional districts, state legislative districts, and there's going to be a separate redistricting fight at the local level. This gets back to grassroots organizing. There is a model for getting grassroots organizers to involved in redistricting fights, and this model was really developed by grassroots organizers who were influenced by SNCC, primarily out of the Mississippi Delta and Jackson. I want to reference in particular the work of Southern Echo, which developed a community-based or community anchor redistricting plan in which they really get cash-strapped communities, Black and brown communities involved in drawing up their plans, developing alliances with cartographers, attorneys, social scientists. And the reason why this is important is because they draw upon a kind of an old argument made by Ella Baker that local organizing, local knowledge, indigenous knowledge knows what's going on in communities, and that kind of information, that kind of knowledge has to be part of drawing redistricting plans. And so this model really comes out of a community organizing approach, primarily perfected by groups like Southern Echo. You find this being adopted by the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights has a participatory redistricting project that they're teaming up with college students. And this matters in a sense because the redistricting fight is going to take place over 1 or 2 years. Grassroots organizations can submit redistricting plans to state legislatures. They may throw them in the trash, which many of them will do. But if you can get a hearing and get them submitted, then if there's a legal fight or legal court case that's going to emerge later on, that information could be used for that legal fight, legal court case. And again, I want to emphasize that this is the attempt by grassroots organizers to take the knowledge that they learned in the streets, learned in these rural communities dating back to the 1960s, taking this knowledge and using it to help shape the redistricting process post-census. Now, just as a kind of conclusion, my last 2 slides is what are some of the areas of research that we need? What are some of the areas of investigation that we need? Emphasis on this, that my argument, most of what we know about, most of what has gone on about organizing, the successes, researchers have not investigated. We still need a lot more information about the ebbs and flows and successes, even of the so-called civil rights movement. So having said all that, where do we go from here? Where does the research go from here? There's some excellent work done on community-based redistricting, criminal justice efforts primarily led by Black women. There's a national coalition of incarcerated women that's doing some great work around advancing caregiver bills across the country. The participatory defense movement has really kind of increased around the country, in which they're bringing in everyday people to observe court proceedings, to be kind of community-based public defenders, so to speak. Reforms around police accountability. What were some of the successes? If we look at Minnesota versus Los Angeles, what were some of the, if we look at, for example, Cleveland versus Nashville, what are some successes? What are some of the failures? Why did some movements succeed? Why did some not succeed? Voting rights, that is community-based redistricting models. And we have a multi-tiered grassroots effort to counter voter suppression, in which everyday people are becoming part of what's called injured parties in court cases. Grassroots mobilization around voter justice, I call it, kind of an MFDP, kind of a Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party style effort of grassroots organizing, grassroots voter mobilization. Groups like Black Voter Matters Fund, and some of the groups that just presented today. Housing equity, we have an anti-eviction movement, we have an anti-gentrification movement. Reproductive justice is also an important movement that's gone on across the country, working on issues such as anti-shackling in prisons of women who are pregnant. And finally, my last slide will say that I think we need to do a lot more investigation on a phrase that I call to make America great. We could start with Perry County. And this is a group that I've done just a tad bit of work in Perry County, Alabama. That's the center of the largest landfill, probably one of the most corruptive and largest corporate landfills in the South. That's in a community of 90% African-American, in an area that's extraordinarily impoverished. And in a national political climate in which national political leaders, when they talk about rule, they don't often include Black folks. And I'm making that point as a way to say, as a conclusionary point, that where do we go from here in terms of research and in terms of organizing is really looking at what's going on in Black rural communities that are particularly the epicenter of COVID-19, environmental racism, environmental injustice, poverty, and severe forms of repression, severe forms of suppression and intimidation. And I think that's one of the things that we should center post 2020 as we move forward. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Franklin. So this has been a fascinating start. I found that the most fascinating panels are where the panelists start asking questions of each other. So I've got a set of prepared questions, but if any of you wanted to start off by pulling on a thread that you saw from another panelist presentation, would very much welcome that at this time, or I can start off with a prepared remark or with a prepared question. So are there any folks who wanted to jump in? Go for it, Ense.
I have a question for Arisha. I know that because like we follow your work, there seems to be like a sort of rigorous research agenda at the core of the communications work that you do. Like y'all just don't say, just because we're Black folks, we know how to talk to Black people. And so I was wondering if there are smart things that you can say or advice that you can give in this particular moment to organizations that have members or bases or folks that just talk to Black people, specifically around misinformation and disinformation. We used to like find lies, particularly like from the president or other elected officials, and be like, this is a lie. And now we know that that might not be the most strategic way to respond. So I'm curious, as we are in the final stretch, I went to high school, I used to live in France, and so I know that as a part of a lot of EU nations, they have a lockdown like the last couple of days, weeks before an election in terms of campaigns, commercials, et cetera. So they really try to protect the integrity of the information that voters are getting. We are definitely in the wild, wild west, and we have to like look out for ourselves. And we got to protect the process and protect the process and protect each other. So yeah, do you have any wisdom for us in this last stretch about like how to not be agents of misinformation and disinformation?
It's a great question. It's an interesting question because I certainly wouldn't think that we have like a rigorous like messaging research sort of system and want like more of that. But I think possibly what you're experiencing comes from this sort of digital first mentality of like trying things, A/B testing things, letting go of things, and keeping what works. And I think that's what we're constantly doing. In terms of, you know, we've learned a lot about disinformation and misinformation, specifically through our tech accountability work, challenging Facebook and Twitter and others on how they're handling not only the disinformation and misinformation, but the hate speech and the targeting specifically of Black activists. And through that process of working through coalitions with others, I mean, we've learned a lot of hard lessons. I think a big part of our messaging comes through making mistakes and trying to change our approach. But one of the pieces that we've learned is that, you know, just pointing out that this is wrong or this is factually wrong, or going out and doing media about how this is wrong and factually wrong actually like does the work of the folks that are seeking to deter or depress Black voters. Like a big piece of the disinformation game is about getting it into the mainstream, having it leave these private groups and having those sort of narratives repeated over and over in major media. And so it's required a lot of discipline because we want to just be like, oh, this is messed up, this is messed up, this is messed up. You see what they're saying, but it's required us and so many others to have a lot of discipline to figure out how to talk about that in ways that don't hurt. And where I think we ultimately settled, you know, as you know, we started talking about disinformation with respect to the election, you know, maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago. And I think where we sort of settled is that the way through disinformation or voter deterrence in our community was about, one, finding a positive vision and message. It was actually about running a Black persuasion campaign. Like no one ever invests in Black communities to run persuasion campaigns. White swing voters get it, Latinx voters get it. We're just like the reliable monolithic Black voting base to so many people. And so we really made an emphasis on what does it look like to persuade Black people and spend our time there. And then I think beyond, in addition to sort of the persuasion effort and trying to find a positive vision of where we want to go, trying to reiterate for folks that government should work for us if we demand that it works for us, like even though it hasn't always worked for us in the past. It's also really emphasizing trusted messengers. You know, the new term is relational organizing, but like talking to your friends and family about the things that they're experiencing online or in the news, we think is a much more effective approach than sort of like the cold, you know, the cold approach that we've been using. And it's your friends and family and neighbors, members of your community, people that you were in some sort of relationship with. And so instead of like piloting paid organizers to come into a community 3 weeks before an election and knock on your door and tell you that it's important to vote, we really think that the work is in establishing a relationship before then. We've always said that we don't want our first conversation with a Black person in any of the places that we do work to be about voting. We want it to be about Black joy. We want it to be about what they want to see in their community. There are tons of different, we want it to be about like how they're surviving through a pandemic. There are tons of conversations that we believe that you can have with folks before you move into this transactional conversation about whether or not folks are going to vote or not.
Fascinating. Anyone else want to jump in on this? The door is open. Want to kick off with one question, with a statement. 90% of Black citizens vote for Democrats in federal elections, which some say is simultaneously a short-term opportunity to power build, but is unhealthy long-term, because we're stuck in a bad equilibrium where Democrats have a history of taking Black voters for granted, and Republicans see a strategy in just in essentially just giving up on Black voters altogether, and instead focus on suppressing their votes. Do you agree with the premise of this statement? And if so, how do we get into a good equilibrium where we have real competition and thus better policy focused on Black voters and Black communities?
I would say that there are more people who live in California than who live in the entire country of Canada. And Canada has like 5 major political parties. It's ridiculous that the United States has 300 million people and only 2 major political parties. And if we're gonna keep it 1,000, then we should probably acknowledge that there are more similarities nationally between the 2 major political parties than any of us are comfortable admitting. And so why are Black Americans and Black voters the center of this question when it is really a question about the health and the robustness of American democracy as a whole? The people are voting based off of the options that are available to them, and thinking about the options that are available to most Black Americans. And again, I have a Georgia lens and a Georgia context. When I used to live in Washington, D.C., I was an active, voting, vocal, donating member of the DC Green Statehood Party. Yeah, I was. Voting green in Georgia means that I am willingly creating an opportunity for Republicans and folks who and say the individual, the citizen, the voter, who has an analysis about the kind of Georgia, the kind of American South that I want to raise a family in, means opening the door and giving them the keys to the castle. And so that feels like a very small, narrow focus when it is, the question is much larger.
Yeah, I think to build off of that, one, I don't like having to follow Ense because she puts things so beautifully and so eloquent in a way that I couldn't, but I fully agree. And I think the conversation should really be around how we're engaging Black voters. I think there is this reliance, and we're seeing it now in polling, right? I don't trust polling. You know, after 2016, I don't trust it. I'm sorry, I don't. No offense to all the researchers and data scientists and stuff out there. I'm always just really cautious because I think a lot of times people, they put too much stock in polling as like a way of saying this is who I need to prioritize versus who I don't, because let's be honest, that's what we're doing. We're prioritizing people and thus prioritizing issues for the sake of winning. We know Black people, we throw it down, right? Like we come through, we save America, we save democracy every dang time. But a lot of times like our issues aren't being reflected at the same time. And so we should be really having conversations about how we're running persuasion campaigns. As was mentioned earlier, like a lot of Black folks don't get that persuasion campaign because there's just an assumption based off of our political leanings. And, you know, we've heard even in through conversations here in Milwaukee, we've heard people say like, I don't really like either one of them, but I'm going to vote because I have to, because I understand the world around me is on fire and I need to do something. I need to do some sort of harm reduction. But people have a deeper political analysis than what we give them credit to. But just because they don't say it in our terms and our language, people have a deeper political analysis than what we give them credit for. And I think that's a bigger symptom of why people aren't engaging our community the same way that you're engaging suburban white women, that everybody all of a sudden needs them. Let's shift our focus there. Or trying to win back the Obama-Trump voters, knowing that the reason that they voted that way is likely due to white supremacy and racism. But let's spend our time centering that versus the folks that are reliable but have to be engaged. We don't need to be persuaded to not vote for a racist, by and large, right? That's a conversation that takes a lot of time and energy that people are willing to have in other communities versus having intentional conversations with us on a year-round basis. And so I don't think I'm answering the question, but I think, you know, offering kind of a reframe and a reshift so people aren't so focused on, oh, well, this is a reliable base, we don't ever need to talk to them, because when that happens and when that thinking happens, 2016 happens.
Can I add to this?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I probably can't add any more, but I do want to just point out that, and I want to recognize, I'm glad that she mentioned the two-party system, because it is a restricted environment. And there's a great book, Paul Feimer talks about party capture, in which the basis of each party, whether you're black or the evangelical Christians on the right, in national politics, they are captured by both parties. But I do also want to say that, I mean, there is a real fundamental, despite the fact that, you know, both parties have an investor class and committed to capital, there is a fundamental difference between both parties. I mean, if you march, I've been in the Tennessee legislature. If you march from the Tennessee legislature to Georgia to Alabama to Florida, I mean, if you look at the issues, voting rights, right to work, or anti-labor union issues, living wage, reproductive justice, I mean, environmental justice, there is just a fundamental difference in the divisions between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And this does not mean that we are in love or someone's in love with the Democratic Party or whatever the case might be. I mean, I myself have, you know, voted green and been to Cuba, you know, from, you know, not the regular way either, not the education way, if I can put it the way that, I mean, so I have my own, but there is a fundamental difference. But having said all that, I also want to lift up two issues that Frederick Douglass said in 1872, that at some point, and sometimes one party is a deck and one party is a sea. And if you jump in the sea, you may get eaten up by sharks. But if you're on this deck on a ship, it might be cranking, it might have holes in it, but you're surviving. And that's, I think, how a lot of Black folks, you know, if I go to some of these communities, that's how they're thinking. It doesn't mean that they are co-opted or that they're brainwashed. It's that they're operating as if through that platform, through that prism, they're operating through a pragmatic lens. But I do want to make this last point. Despite the fact that you have a 90% to 10% threshold, Black organizers are very sophisticated. If you go to state legislatures and you look at the work of Black organizers, and I know the Tennessee state legislature, they're getting legislation done, not just because they're appealing to Democrats, but they're doing really targeted alliance building, even with kind of moderate Republicans, so to speak. If you look at a lot of counties across the South, where frankly, they're led by Republican Party mayors. Oftentimes the black Democrats are going to be the swing vote to make sure that a far right-wing mayor or county commissioner doesn't get in office. It may still be a Republican, but they're using their vote in strategic terms. So I just want to lift that up, that black voters are using their vote in far more strategic terms than I think many people want to credit them.
And I'll just add in, I think it's so strange to be an electoral organizer or a Black electoral organizer in this space, because on the one hand, there's this narrative about our votes being on lock, and we are traditionally the most reliable voting block for the Democratic Party. And then, like 3 days after election, if it doesn't go the right way, it'll be Black voters' fault. And so we're like constantly living in this dynamic. Despite the fact that it is, white swing voters who are voting against their economic interests a lot of the times, despite the fact that there are other communities that still need to be convinced about who they should be voting for and where they should be showing up and how that impacts the forward trajectory of their lives. I also think it's interesting to be a Black electoral organizer at this time, because those notions of Black loyalty to the Democratic Party are each year become less and less true. And it's not because younger Black folks are, swinging to vote for Republicans who aren't even, for the most part, aren't even trying to get our vote. At the national level, we had a candidate who was actively trying to deter us from voting. But I think I hope to be alive during this time period where folks begin to realize on the left that we're not as reliable as they need us to be unless they do the things that we are demanding. Because I just see, I think we're moving away with every year someone gets younger, every year another person turns 18. I think we're moving away from that sort of entrenched loyalty. And younger folks are like, yeah, I know what you did in the past, but what have you done for me now? And I think that's the question. That is the conversations that we've been having with Democratic politicians. I don't want to hear what you did in the 80s about some stuff that I don't even agree with now. I want to hear about how you're going to show up today and meet the moment that we're in.
And I think this is a very powerful statement. Do you think then this is to all of the panelists, do you think we're getting closer to that in the past 4 years? Do you think there's been a greater recognition of that within our kind of circle of allies, or not?
I mean, I personally think we're in a very unique moment with this president and with this party and what is being enabled. I think Black people see it, and I think we can walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. But the vibe that's being set, the culture that's being enabled, doesn't lead to good places for Black people or other people of color. So I don't know. I don't think it's a fair A/B test.
Sure. Yeah. There is an argument that this is such a weird and crazy kind of point in history that there's really nothing that we can compare this to. Do you see, and anyone feel free to jump in, are you hopeful?
I am. I wouldn't be doing I wouldn't be doing this work if I wasn't. I'm not a fan of or prone to going on what we call dummy missions. I absolutely believe that we will win. I absolutely believe that we can build and harness the power that we need in order, again, to stop bad things from happening and to build the world that, right now only our minds can conceive of. I feel it. I'm super hopeful. Yeah. There's no way that I could keep doing this work day in and day out. if I didn't believe that it was adding up to the change that we wanted to see. And I think honestly, a lot of people feel that way. I think if, you can tell, like there are times when people, my vote doesn't matter, the system is rigged, et cetera. And people still keep showing up. And like there are all these stories about voter suppression in Georgia and white supremacist violence at the polls. And we've had historic participation in our elections for the first 3 days of early voting, a 41% jump over 2016. So I don't think that I'm alone in believing that things can and will be better.
You're not.
I think for me, because I've been getting this question a lot lately, just because the world is on fire. I think there's a couple things. One, I talked to a woman a few months ago over the summer, and I asked her if she was voting. And she said, no, I just look out for me and my son. The world doesn't look out for me. I just have to prioritize me and my son. And that's all that matters. And so I started to engage with her, ask her, why. She really kind of broke down in like this heartbreaking story and the trauma that she had gone through in her life, and how there's various touch points where society and systems have failed her. And so she said that she wasn't down for voting, but I asked her, I was like, would you be willing to share your story to the mayor? Would you be willing to share your story with the governor? And she said, absolutely. And so for me, I understand when people say, my vote doesn't matter, or I don't think my voice makes a difference in this bigger political system. But a lot of times people aren't completely turned off from the idea of civic engagement. We just need to bring them along and kind of reframe and reshift their thinking and how they see themselves politically. So as long as there's those openings and those entryways, I feel hope. And then there's a thing that I have to remind myself. There's a quote that says, we are our ancestors' wildest dreams. And I hold on to that. And then I have to tack on a second part of it. I think about how, Black organization like BLOC wouldn't have existed, 30, 40 years ago. And so I am, and BLOC is a physical manifestation of our ancestors' dreams realized, but then also knowing that future generations will be my wildest dreams. And even though as much as I want this change to happen now, I need to make peace with the fact that I may not see it in my lifetime, and my job was just to set another layer, of work and of a foundation for other people to pick up the mantle and to pass that torch. So thinking and kind of conceptualizing and almost like making peace with the fact that there's this big radical transformative change that we want to see that we may not be able to, but what can we do right now to set up, the trajectory for future generations?
I know myself, I'm very, very, very hopeful. I think that it's also imperative that since we bridge the gap, that it's imperative that we be hopeful. I tell people all the time, if we're phone banking right now and I call you and you hang up the phone, or you let me go through my spiel and you say, I don't believe in voting, I still made you think about voting, and in hopes that you probably call your friend and say, these people keep calling my phone about voting, and that'll make other people even think about it. And so I think it's very, very imperative that we not only be hopeful, because we're transporting those different messages to people, right? And so in having those quality conversations, I'm very, very hopeful.
And I agree with all that's been said. And I think on a certain level, the job of community organizer is to be hopeful. That's the job most of the time. It's 90% of it is to remain hopeful. The first definition of leadership or community organizing that I ever learned was taking responsibility for enabling others to achieve shared purpose in the face of great uncertainty. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not frustrated or upset, like when RBG dies and you're like, oh, can't take anything else, or that you're not going on a Twitter rant. And I know we hate the word resilience in our community because it feels like this weight and obligation, but I think that's what it is. It's finding a way forward. As I think about the different campaigns that I've won or we've won at Color of Change, we have always been losing before we won. It has always felt like we have been losing. And I know we're making progress in this broader arc in the last several years in terms of the conversation around criminal justice, in terms of a number of conversations. And yet, with each new video that comes out of an abusive police officer, it just feels that like trauma is re-triggered. And like we are constantly reminding our team, like, yeah, this is what winning feels like. You know, this is what winning feels like. We will know when to celebrate. We will get there. We will see it. But I think the job is hope.
I guess it's my turn. Yeah, I'm hopeful, but mainly because a lot of my mentors have told me that, you know, it's good to be hopeful because of the creative energy that exists in people and organizers in particular, that they can find a creative energy to push for change, even when it appears as if there are obstacles and barriers in your way. So, and then I think about, you know, even maybe nostalgia. If you think about, you know, since from the time of Ulysses Grant's presidency to the time of Lyndon Johnson, and maybe that's a maybe, every single U.S. president never thought you could beat Jim Crow or even come close to beating it. They thought you could put a man on the moon or a woman on the moon. They thought you could beat Nazism, fascism. But when it came to beating Jim Crow in their own backyard, but the people who did believe in it were everyday Black folks, and it was really won by everyday Black folks who spent years in the streets, in the rural communities, SNCC, SCLC, Black women, Highlander. I can go on and on and on and on, which is kind of the focus a lot of my research right now. I'm kind of revisiting that period of time and documenting organizing work, activism work, and that's a story to tell right there. That these everyday Black folks, largely with no money, no resources, thought they could beat a system that the most powerful persons in the world said could not be beaten. And I use that as an example that they found a creative energy in them to experiment, to learn to succeed, to fail, to move forward. So I use that as a way to say that, yeah, I'm very hopeful because we have a creative energy in our community that could find a way politically to at least not just survive, but also advance kind of transformative and prophetic change.
I'll close by saying, unfortunately, we're out of time. This is it's been an incredible conversation that I wish we could continue for another couple hours. But I'm hopeful for 5 reasons. 1, Sekou. 2, Arisha. 3, Rod. 4, Ense. And 5, Angela. This is, you guys have, or everyone on this panel is doing incredible work. The hard work, the unglamorous work of researching and organizing, and going through the ups and downs of getting us to a better place. And I'm humbled to be among this panel. So thank you so much for sharing your time. Thank you for sharing your experience and your heart. And we hope to continue this conversation. And kind of a small note just to get Arisha and Angela's and Rod's and Ense's time. Black Power just went exponential yesterday. So I'll be in touch. But thank you so much for taking time out of your day to share your thoughts. And we really sincerely hope that we can continue this conversation. Thank you again.
Thank you.
I just want to say thank you to the panel again on behalf of the entire Howard University community. This session has been recorded and we've been streaming live to Facebook. So many people have had the opportunity to join us through those methods. And we will be posting this entire session with all of the sessions for the HU Ideas Symposium from protest to policy will be posted on the Howard University website. And I hope that you will be able to share this incredibly important panel with many of your own audiences. Thank you so much for joining us. Our next panel will begin at 11:30. It's entitled Black Women, Suffrage, and the False Promise of Equality. And we'll have Professor Lisa Crooms Robinson Professor Kanisha Grant and Professor Pearl Ford Dow joining us at 11:30. Thank you so much to our panelists for being here this morning.
Thank you.